Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part A. Introductory Chapters. Chapter 2. History, Historiography, and the Biblical Text. The word history, historia in Greek, means inquiry or knowledge acquired through investigation. After the Greek historian Herodotus used this term as the name for his book about the wars between the Greeks and the Persians, its meaning solidified for the purpose of describing events, processes, and periods based on the study of ancient sources. This is the origin story of the distinction between history and story, a term that also describes events, processes, and periods, but not necessarily ones based on investigation and documentation. Historical research deals with the study of the past based on written documents. The data historians collect are first and foremost written data, such as diaries, letters, and certificates, but they also include the oral sources, including interviews and recorded or photographed documents, as well as documentation from non-written sources, such as maps and photographic or cinematic documentation. Then, historians analyze the historical meaning of that emerges from the sources. Historians of ancient times also based their historical reconstruction on archaeological finds, whose historical significance they aim to extract. An additional source, an essential part of historical research, is descriptions by ancient historians who worked to reconstruct and describe different periods and events. Most historians deal with the reconstruction and analysis of the sequence of documented events that have common context, often within a specific timeline, since they need to understand the different languages involved, be able to read the sources they base their research on, and be familiar with the various geographic locations and the sequence of events surrounding the period they are researching. For this reason, most historians specialize in a certain period within a well-defined geographic area. Thus, clearly, historical research deals with cultures that developed and maintained systems of writing and left written records which historians can find and study. This is the basic difference between historical research and prehistoric research, which deals with periods prior to the invention of writing. This is, of course, a very broad definition. Indeed, historical research has developed diverse tools which are not based on written texts to study societies that didn't rely on written texts, periods from or about which there are no written sources, and also the ability to study prehistoric periods with historic research tools. All historical research is based on engagement with the source material and on the distinction between the sources and their interpretations. Historians distinguish between primary sources, which are sources from the area in which the events occurred, and secondary sources, which are sources that refer to or describe the earlier events secondhand and are usually based on primary sources. The first step in any historical study is to organize the sources according to their timeline, the relationship between them, the order, the degree of reliability, etc. As such, the first criticism that must be directed towards historians' work concerns these questions. Did historians found all the known sources on the topic? Did they edit them in the right order? Did they extract all the potential information from the sources available to them? Did they compare problematic sources and resolve the problems and contradictions which arise between them? Are all sources equally reliable? Is it possible to base research on all sources in the same way? Only later, in the second stage of the historical research, comes the reconstruction and description of the sequence of events and their historical order, which is supposed to be an objective reconstruction based on an interpretation of the sources. In the third stage, the historian interprets, explains, analyzes, and tries to explain causality. Why did things happen the way they did? What led the course of events? Which characters influenced them? What do these things mean and how did they impact the future? This process carries the danger of falling into anachronism. In recent years, this notion has become more challenging and prominent than before, owing to the common tendency to use modern tools to make judgments about events and people who acted in the past, often from feministic, colonialist, and post-colonialist perspectives, in many cases without understanding or by deliberately ignoring the ancient reality and values of those in distant or even not so distant days on fundamental issues such as the role of women and the slavery, the value of human life, the place of animals, the treatment of the local population in areas occupied by superpowers, the exploitation of natural resources, and many other subjects. All of this holds great significance for the study of the Bible and of biblical history. Do we judge the attitude of the biblical authors toward women, towards the phenomenon of slavery, towards homosexuality, animal sacrifice, or various other issues based on positions accepted by much of the Western world today? Or are we able to understand and analyze the positions of the authors of the Bible, of the biblical text, against the background of the culture and reality of the ancient Near East? It is critical to emphasize here the difference between the facts and the history. The latter is always a story told by historians, applying their version of the events. In this context, it is always important to know the historian's sources, or the primary or secondary sources, the purpose of their writing, and the intended target audience. Flavius Josephus, for example, was an eyewitness to the Great Revolt of Judea, but he wrote his version and description as a Roman patron and intended his description to be read by the Roman audience. Thanks to him, we know a lot about these events, but is the picture he describes necessarily accurate? On the other hand, we do not have Flavius Josephus to describe the Bar Kokhba revolt that happened 60 years later, so this event remains almost completely unknown. Extrapolating from this, it is clear that a secular Jewish historian would not describe the modern history of the State of Israel in the same way as an Orthodox Jewish historian. Moreover, the description of a Palestinian Muslim historian will differ in emphasis, interpretation, and perhaps also in the facts that they choose to highlight and base their historical depiction on. With that in mind, my first challenge will be to determine which sources the authors of biblical history used. What did they base their description on? How accurate are their sources? And do they allow us to reconstruct a reliable historical reality based on their descriptions, even when relating to the very distant past, hundreds of years before the time in which they were composed. Following that, I will seek to find the purpose for which the biblical authors wrote and the intended target audience for their historical descriptions. After all, they were writing to a specific audience of people. As we will establish later, these people were, like the historiographers themselves, members of the Jerusalemite elite. The readers also knew the history they knew. Indeed, the authors of the biblical accounts could not change the historical reality that was known to their contemporaries, for better or for worse. They could emphasize things, they could ignore things, they could explain things, but not change the known history, regardless of whether it is an accurate history which accurately reflects the reality of the past. Within this as context, it is also important to know the term historiography, which I will mention many times throughout this podcast. This term is composed of two Greek words, which literally mean the writing of history and refers to the study of the way historians describe history, which sources they choose to prefer, and which sources they decide to set aside, ignore, or keep as low priority. Later on, I will argue that the biblical authors were historiographers, and my main interest is in examining what they choose to describe and emphasize in their descriptions alongside what they choose to omit or de-emphasize. Biblical historiography will be at the center of the upcoming discussion, so I continue from here to an examination of the unique nature of biblical historiography and to explain the accepted methods in the research and study of this field. In the historical world, it is customary to mark the beginning of history in the classical sense with the Hellenistic period, when the first known historians describing the history of their time were active. The history departments at most universities worldwide begin its research and teaching in the classical periods. Knowing this, it is clear why the history of the biblical period does not belong to historical disciplines. And at most universities, it studies either in faculties of theology or in research institute for archaeology and ancient Near Eastern culture, in accordance with the scholars' emphasis on dealing with the main source of their research. Notably, biblical history or biblical historiography is not a usual historical discipline. It is based first and foremost on biblical literature, mainly on historiographical literature, but also on prophetic literature, poetry, and laments. None of these are historical sources. They were not written as historical sources and were not intended to describe the historical reality as it was. Indeed, these descriptions didn't intend to reflect a historical reality, but to use history as it was known to the generations in which it was written, to convey the ideological, religious, and political messages of specific groups at specific times and for specific perspectives. The authors of the biblical accounts never claimed to have been reflecting a historical reality. They were not trying to be historians, nor did their readers think they were reading a clean history. As already explained, the writings were in fact an interpretation of the history that was known to the writers and their target audience, intended to convey messages in the present time when they were written to an audience of readers known to the authors, with the aim of explaining to this audience why things happened, how they can learn from history, and above all, how they should behave in their present time. These descriptions were not written for us, nor for any other audience distant from the authors in their time or place. They were not written for people outside their close realm, who lack the knowledge the authors had, who do not understand things the authors and their target audience considered obvious at the time of writing. Readers from later eras who no longer know the historical reality as the biblical authors and readers perceived it in their own time, no longer have inherent understanding of things the way they were intended to be understood by the text target audience. Despite this, biblical writings are the only source that describe the history of the people of Israel from the creation of the world until the destruction of the first temple, the exilic period, the days of the return of some of the exiles to Zion, and the early Second Temple era. What are the characteristics of the biblical text, and what are the problems with reading it as a historical source? I will repeat my starting point. The biblical story of the kingdom of Judah, as told in the books of Samuel and Kings, describes the point of view of the Jerusalemite elite, what it knew, what it wanted to tell, and what served its political, religious, and economic interests. Throughout processes we don't have much knowledge about, the writers in Jerusalem attained written and oral sources, some of them very ancient, which reflect ancient times before the establishment of the monarchy. Some of these sources were created during the hundreds of years in which the kingdoms of Israel and Judah existed. Some probably arrived in their original form as oral stories or on written scrolls, as ancient poetry, ancient prayers that were considered of great importance, or prophecies recorded from the mouth of various prophets known in these kingdoms, or at least attributed to these prophets. Some were consolidated stories concerning the lives of prophets, wars, or miraculous events, decisive battles, or other occurrences in the history of the nation and the country. Some of these sources arrived in Judah after they were compiled and edited, such as the Book of Saviors, which included ancient heroic stories of saviors who operated in the territories of the Kingdom of the North, the Kingdom of Israel, even prior to its establishment, and whose adaptation formed the basis for the Deuteronomistic Book of Judges. Many researchers agree that all of these sources were first compiled into a comprehensive historiographical work towards the end of the First Temple period, likely during the time of King Josiah, king of Judah, and after the cultic reform that took place in Judah during this period, probably around 622 BCE. This work served the political, religious, and economic interests of the Jerusalemite elite and religious ideas that prevailed at the time in the kingdom's capital. It included the sources held in the temple library in Jerusalem at the time, some of which, as mentioned, had come from the kingdom of Israel after it was destroyed about a century earlier, whereas others were written in the small kingdom of Judah itself. Various diverse literary sources were incorporated into this work, including multiple administrative lists, such as the list of kings in Judah, the years of their reign, and the names of their mothers, which form the chronological skeleton for the entire composition, as well as the calculations of the timing of various events and of the synchronisms with the kings who had reigned in Israel. Had this work been composed a century or two earlier, it might have been written and edited differently, not only in terms of the sources incorporated into it, but also in terms of the shaping of the history and the main ideas that the descriptions would seek to convey. The conclusion we can derive from all of this is that the historical description, which is embedded in the ancient layer that laid the foundation for the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the biblical historiography, was intended for the generations for which it was composed. However, most scholars assume that this early layer included only the small part of the text of these books as we have them today, and that most of the text of these books was written through various stages of additions and edits only later, towards the end of the First Temple period, during the exilic period, the post-exilic times, and even in the early Hellenistic period. This historical description was written with the intent to convey the ideological message to the members of its own generation, and especially to the Jerusalem elite of that time period. It was text written by and for that Jerusalem elite, based on their available sources and on the history that was known to them at the time. The historians who composed this early historiographical composition, the first and earliest work written in Judah as a comprehensive, all-inclusive work, and the earliest part found in the Hebrew Bible as we know it today, reflected their own worldview within it. They aimed not to tell the history of Judah or the history of Israel and Judah, but to explain the historical progression, the overall situation, and the reasons why Judah and Jerusalem were where they were at that period of time. This is a historiographical text designed to explain history, not historical literature designed to plainly record what happened. That is how it should be read and understood. When was the biblical historiographical description written? What were its sources? Which ideas guided the writing of the biblical historiography? These are the issues we will deal with in the coming chapters.